So now let's welcome Dr. James Hills. He's a research and development team leader at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, Dairy Centre. He focuses on feed-based animal nutrition and precision agriculture and understanding variability and managing that variability. So, James, variable irrigation is all yours.
I'm not sure that I can compete with the last two speakers in terms of lateral thinking. Irrigation, let's see how exciting I can make it. When Yanni asked me to come up here and speak about irrigation, I was thinking back through the last 3 years and the technology that we've been working on, and what I realised was that it wasn't so much the technology that was making the difference, it was the issues that we saw in terms of monitoring and measuring farmers' irrigation practices that revealed very clearly that farmers using irrigation were not getting the basics right. And where we can see the biggest impact in terms of irrigation management is on helping farmers to understand what they're not getting right, understanding where the losses are, and the way that we were able to do that is to go out there and actually measure what was happening. Now that might sound pretty boring, but no, as we all understand, if you fail to measure, then you can't really manage that system. So just taking that as an introduction, the power of data. It's something that I think is really, really important, and it's certainly a lesson that we've learnt. If we can understand what is happening within our system, we can far better manage that system to be able to improve efficiencies. And so when we started doing quite a bit of work in irrigation, one of the first things we did when we went out to farmers was we just put a whole heap of sensors out on farms. So we measured things like the pump and what was happening in terms of the delivery of water. We measured what was happening to the irrigation system, what was happening to soil moisture and what was happening to the weather, collected all that information, put it into a system where we could have a look at what that meant, and then as a result of that we were able to then go back and start to deal with the issues that we were identifying. Now, one of the examples of a powerful impact that we saw in the work that we were doing was just very simply in measuring power use. So on this particular farm, we measured power use through the irrigation season. During that particular season, this farmer was using 787 kilowatt hours per megalitre, and when we looked at the system that he was using, we said, why don't you just replace the pump and the motor? We reckon you can get it down to 266 kilowatt hours per megalitre. Just by going and doing that, that farmer saved $120 per meg, or more than $15,000 in the season. So spent about $6,000 to save about $15,000. So it's a fairly good payback period. But the point being made here is that farmer had been using that system for about 15 years. So you imagine $150,000, $200,000 more that he could have used to invest in making a difference to his system, just because he wasn't measuring it, just because he didn't understand the impact that it was having. So certainly powerful impact through just measuring power or energy. The project that I've been working on in the past 3 years is part of a Rural R&D for Profit project. It's a national project, and we were working in Tasmania on the dairy component, where we were looking at increasing farm profit through efficient use of irrigation input to dairy pastures. So this was a project that was funded by the federal government, Dairy Australia and the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. And essentially we went out and set up systems on 5 different farms and measured what was happening on those farms. And the way that we did it is that we went out, and in the first year all we did was collect the data. So we just focused on having a look at what was happening. In fact, we said to the farmers, we don't want you to do any changes to the system, we just want you to do what you normally do. And we're not going to talk to you at all through the season. So they knew that there was stuff out there, but we were not interacting with those farmers at all. In the second year, we began to provide them with some of the information that we were collecting in a way that they could at least see what was happening. So we gave them access to the visual components of the soil moisture and some of those things. And then in the third year of the project, we actually interacted with the farmers and tried to help them to understand that system. So that was the approach we took in terms of the data collection and the impact. Now, in terms of my talk today, I want to just focus on one of those 5 sites, the Cressy site. I don't have time to go through a lot of the other sites. I want to think particularly about scheduling and the Green Drought, because that's where we've identified the major loss in our irrigation systems. I want to think a little bit about variable rate irrigation, because part of the answer to the problems on this site involve the use of variable rate irrigation, and perhaps at the end we might actually get onto some of the advanced management things that we could use in terms of autonomous irrigation. Just remembering that in our pasture-based systems, because this is all about irrigating pastures, the pasture is really the pot of gold that's at the end of the rainbow. If you can get that pasture to grow effectively and efficiently, well then certainly you're going to have a big impact on the profitability of that system. So thinking about the Cressy Pivot in particular, a fairly large pivot. Here's the dairy over here. So there's 117 hectares. We have an irrigation channel that runs right through the middle and a couple of major laneways and about 13 or 14 paddocks under that particular pivot. It was a valley centre pivot irrigator, 569 metres in length. The water source from the irrigation channel, aiming to put on about 12 mils per application. The system capacity of that particular pivot was 6.7 millimetres per day, and the reason that I emphasise that is that that's one of the very important metrics that you need to understand in terms of irrigation to get your scheduling right. Okay, it is the amount of water, the depth of water that you can apply with your system in a 24-hour period, and you need to understand that, and we'll see why in a minute. So the system capacity was 6.7 millimetres per day. So in terms of putting on 12 mils, it was probably taking about 2 days to achieve that, so he could put on 6.7 mils a day. So there's an example of that pivot. There was an undulating site high up on the western end, and then it dropped down to a lower plane down on the eastern end of the pivot. So here's some of the variability associated with that site. So we've got our elevation, the high end of the pivot, the low end of the pivot down here. This is a couple of EM maps, deep and shallow EM maps. What you can definitely see is that there's a fair area of soil here that's quite different to some of the characteristics up here, and there's some gullies down here where we get quite a bit more moisture on that particular site. Using that information that we've collected in terms of the site, the variability in the soils and the topography, we selected 3 different sections to be able to get an understanding of the soil and then to put our soil moisture probes. So we needed to be able to identify what differences were occurring across that site in terms of our soil moisture and in terms of the way in which we could manage it. And so we selected these 3 sites based on the information that we'd collected. And if we think about those soils, what we needed to do was to understand what was the characteristic of that soil, how much water could that soil hold that would help us to understand the importance around scheduling and irrigating. And so up on the top part of the pivot, we dug our soil pit there, and we noted that the roots went down to about 40 centimetres. In some of the gullies on the second site, where it was quite a bit wetter, we saw that the roots went down to about 30 centimetres, and then down on that bottom area that was red on the EM map, where we had a lot more ironstone, our roots only went down to 15 centimetres. So what is so relevant about that? Why do we want to understand that? Well, essentially, it's that information that will help us to understand how much water is available for the pasture to grow. And so if we take the soil cores and we do some tests on those, what we found was that in the top 30 centimetres, which is where most of your roots are, there was about 35 millimetres of water that was stored in that 30 centimetres. Of that 35 mils, 19 millimetres of that water is readily available. And that's a really key metric that you need to understand. How much readily available water is there within the root zone? And so when I talk about readily available water, basically if you think of a sponge, if you take that sponge and you fill it up with water until there's water dripping out the bottom of it, well, that's saturated. If you sit that there and allow that to drain to the point where there's no more dripping out of it, that's what you call field capacity. And if you then take that and just squeeze it gently, a lot of water comes out quite easily. That's your readily available water. The plants don't have to work hard to draw that water out. When you get to the point where you've got to work hard to squeeze it, there's still water in it, but you've got to work hard. There's a lot of energy. That's where you're dropping below your refill point. And so your readily available water is between your refill point and your field capacity. That's what I'm talking about. We need to understand that if we're going to be able to schedule our irrigation right. And so that's one of the key metrics that we want to try and understand. So if we look at this particular site here, up on the top of the pivot where we have roots down to 40 centimetres, we have readily available water of 25 millimetres. Okay, so there's 25 millimetres of available water in the bucket where the roots are to be able to grow in that part of the pivot. Down in the gullies, we have about 19 millimetres of readily available water. And then down on that bottom area, where we have that ironstone, where we only have 15 centimetres of roots, we only have 9.5 millimetres of available water. So obviously there is a challenge in terms of what we need to do in watering to be able to adequately water that pivot as a whole. And we need to understand that readily available water amount. For each of those 3 sites, we put in our soil moisture probes. So this is up at site number 1, up on top of the pivot. And what you'll notice there is that water was being drawn from 10, so this here is your measure of your soil moisture at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 and 60 centimetres down the profile. And what you'll notice is that water was being drawn from 10, 20, 30 and even down to 40 centimetres. So you can certainly see that there must have been roots down to about that depth. If you look at the probe that was in those wetter gullies, well, certainly we stay wet right through the season. If we look at the bottom section there, in terms of the soil moisture probe data, we're really only getting soil moisture movement in the top 10 and maybe a little bit at 20 centimetres. So certainly there's nowhere near the depth of roots and there's nowhere near the use of that water. So those soil moisture probes are telling you a story about what's happening at each of those particular sites, and it's all related very much to that rooting depth. Some of the other challenges on this site is that having those gullies, there were a lot of wet holes, and people who have pivots, you know all about wheel ruts and the issue of being able to manage that in terms of the use of your pivots. There was a big issue there in terms of this pivot. I think a lot of people understand those sort of challenges. And if you think of the way in which pivots have been designed, they've been designed to turn on and just run. Now, if you've got an issue with pivot, wet holes, you've got an issue with the ability to be able to do that, and that was certainly an issue on this site. Other issues, obviously, in terms of the way that the pivot's being maintained, that has an impact on uniformity. So this here is an example of the uniformity of the pivot. So he's aiming to put on about 12 or 13 millimetres, this line here. When we actually put our catch cans out, what are we seeing? That in that first half of the pivot, we're getting a lot of it only putting 10 or less mils in that particular run. Up on this end of the pivot, we're certainly getting a little bit more on. If you are expecting to put on 12 millimetres and yet you're getting anywhere between 6 or 7 and 13 or 14, that's going to have an impact on the efficiency of that particular pivot. So we only had a coefficient of uniformity of 78%. You probably want to be 90, okay, to be a system that runs really well. The other thing that we needed to know about that site is the evapotranspiration. So in Cressy, and this is Tassie for you, our maximum evapotranspiration in summer is about 7 millimetres. So we're losing about 7 millimetres a day. I think up here or in South Australia and other places, you're probably 10, 11, even 12 millimetres. So there's an important message here, and that is that the system capacity needs to be capable of replacing the water that is disappearing out of the system through evapotranspiration. And so it's a really important figure that you need to understand. So just a quick summary of the site. System capacity of 6.7 mils, a highly variable site, readily available water of somewhere between 9 and 25 mils, issues with bogging, uniformity issues. We're losing about 7 mils a day maximum in the middle of summer. And so maybe continuous irrigation required in January, and variable rate application could be beneficial. So that's just some of the data that is collected on the site to help us to understand how to manage. So where are the losses in these systems? And I want to argue that it is all around irrigation scheduling and getting it right. And so what I want to do is just to demonstrate over the 3 years that we monitored this site, some of the issues that we saw as a result of seeing what was happening, measuring it, and then relaying that information back to the farmer. Just remembering that when it comes to irrigation scheduling, the 3 things that are really important to understand. Firstly, the amount of readily available water we have, so the bucket, the depth of the bucket that the roots are growing in. The second thing is how much is disappearing out of that bucket through evapotranspiration, and how much we can put back into that bucket, the system capacity. They're the three things we need to know to get irrigation right. And obviously soil moisture probes, they help you to visualise what's happening under the soil. So let's assume that we are up at that pit that we dug right on top of the pivot, where we had about 24, 25 millimetres of readily available water. Let's assume that we're in January, where we have an ET max of around 6.7 mils, our system capacity of 6.7 mils, and we're going to water every third day. So let's just assume that that's what we're going to do. Okay, we start off after a nice rain event with, this here is soil moisture deficit, and we have our soil at our field capacity at 0. Okay, so for the first 2 days after that rain event, we do nothing, and so what happens is the water is being taken out of that system. So we lose down to about 13 mils. We then water for a day. We put 6.7 mils in, but we lose about 6.7 mils. We then wait for a couple of days and we drop down again, and then we water again. What are we seeing happening here? We're starting to drop below what is termed that readily available zone. We then stop watering for a couple of days, and then we turn it on, and by that time we're starting to realise that the pasture is drying out. We better turn it on and leave it on. So no rain, we turn that irrigator on, we leave it on constantly, 24 hours a day. What's happening? We're putting 6.7 mils in, the 6.7 mils going out. So what are we doing? We're flatlining. But what's the problem here? We're not getting the moisture in the soil to that readily available water level, and so we're having a big impact on pasture production. And the problem is that system enables the pasture to stay green, so the pasture looks pretty good, but it's just not growing effectively. And that's the issue that we've seen again and again in Tasmania. So let's go and have a look at some of the data that we collected. So on this particular site, back in 2016, the farmer, when we did our pasture walks and measured the pasture, and we did that on a weekly basis, he grew somewhere between 30 and 40 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. The pivot looked pretty green, it looked okay, but when you actually went out there and measured it, you were only achieving that productivity. And in that season, he used 6.2 megalitres of water per hectare, which is what you would expect on a reasonably dry year. So he was putting water into the system, and yet he was only achieving this sort of growth. What's going on? And so what we did is we said, well, let's actually have a look at a water budget. And let's have a look at our water budget for February. In that particular month, we only had a little bit of rain right at the very end. So here we have our irrigation through that particular month. We started off at the beginning of February after a big rain event at the end of January. So we had a full profile of water through a rain event. This here represents our readily available water, say 24, 25 mils here, this shaded area. And so what we saw is that a day or so after rain, we started to see that the soil was drying out. So here we have our soil moisture deficit. We then irrigated, it dried out. We then irrigated, dried out. We then irrigated. And can you see the pattern here? What's happened? The deficit is dropped well below that readily available zone. What we needed to do, if we were irrigating here, was to take this and stick it up in this zone here. So the problem there, and the problem that occurred right through that season, is it wasn't that he was irrigating, but he was irrigating and using his scheduling such that he was only putting water in, and it wasn't lifting it back up to that readily available zone. And so we're getting really poor growth. And we typically see that if you're watering like that, then you're only achieving your 30 to 40 kilos a day. And we've certainly seen that year in, year out. In the second year that we monitored, where we started to supply some feedback to the farmer, our pasture growth rates here in kilos of dry matter per hectare per day started off fairly well at around 80 kilos per day. And in January, after convincing the farmer to turn his irrigator on and to keep going, we managed to get it back up to about 80. But we had a big problem here in the middle where his pasture production dropped right down to about 40 to 50 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. We had a little bit of an issue coming in here because the problem was the farmer had never grown so much pasture in January as what he was achieving at this point. And so he didn't have enough cows to be able to manage it, and he had some issues as a result of that. So he wasn't able to utilise his pasture as well as what he could. Now, when we looked at the soil moisture probe for that particular site, you can certainly see that there was a period of time where things were drying out significantly, and that's what the probes were telling us. So if we take that and we actually do a simple water budget and have a look at this issue of the green drought again, essentially what we've seen here, and here again we have our soil moisture deficit, we have our rain events in grey, our irrigation events in blue. This is the representation of our soil moisture deficit, our readily available zone here. If we think of this particular scenario here, this month and a half, the average evapotranspiration was 4.3 millimetres a day through that period. Rain and irrigation required to match how much was disappearing, 198 mils. He actually put on between his irrigation and his rain 191 millimetres. So you look at that and you say, well look, we're matching about right in terms of the amount of water required and the amount of water that was applied in that particular situation. But what's the problem? Where is the issue here in this? Because what we're seeing is that the soil moisture is drying out, essentially because after rain he waited too long to begin to irrigate again. So we ended up with a deficit down here. He started to irrigate, but that irrigation wasn't allowing it to be lifted up. He got another rain event here, and then he had a period of time where he waited too long, and then we get this situation where it was only right at the very end of that period we managed through 2 irrigations and 2 rains to get the soil moisture back up into that readily available zone. And so the problem here is this. Not that he's not putting water in the system, but that he's putting water in the system and not correcting the issue with the deficit, not getting it up to that readily available zone. And so what was the impact in terms of pasture growth? We were about 83 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. We dropped down to 43, and then we're only starting to lift it back up towards the end. Can you see the point here is that we can put all this effort into irrigating, and yet we're not seeing a response. And the reason we're not seeing a response is this. So the green drought, it stays green, it looks okay, and you end up managing that system to what your expectations are. And what we've seen is that happening again and again and again. They're really doing themselves out of productivity. In the final year, they started off, it was a fairly good season, but we also started off with our irrigation right rather than allowing it to dry out too much. That's one of the issues we see. Too many people fail to start their irrigation early enough. They allow the system to dry out and then they don't manage to get it back up again to a level that leads to reasonable growth. But we managed to achieve pretty good growth. In December we dropped away a little bit as we headed towards maturity, but we kept production between 60 and 80 kilos, and then right at the end there was an armyworm issue in March. But essentially we saw a much better production, and we used about 5.1 megs in that particular season as opposed to 6.2 in the first season. So just a bit of a summary. If we look at those 3 years that we monitored that site, in 2015-16 our average growth rate was about 34 kilos of dry matter. We used 6.2 megalitres per hectare of irrigation, and we grew about 6.2 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. It was a very dry year, so it was a fairly difficult year, but we had a fairly poor water use efficiency. By the final year, we were growing about 70 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, about 12 tonnes, and we had double the water use efficiency in that particular system. So you can certainly see the massive change over those 3 years from what was being achieved to what he managed to achieve through that process. The opportunity loss in that first year, because he wasn't getting his watering right, was approximately 35 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. That is about 368 tonnes of pasture over 3 months, and at about $200 a tonne for extra feed that was purchased to replace what he hadn't grown, to fill the gap, that's over $70,000 of extra cost over 3 months. That's what the farmer was doing in terms of his calculations. So you can certainly see that if you're not getting it right, it's costing you a lot of money. So the summary there is that there's certainly power in data. If you can get out there and measure and use that data to help you to understand what you're achieving compared with what you should be able to achieve, then there's certainly power there. We've got to be beware of the green drought. Keeping the bucket topped up is key, and poor watering costs production of money. So that's really the key message that I wanted to get to you. Certainly we've run out of time, but remember that on that site, one of the issues he had was his ability to put that irrigator on and run it. So in the middle of January, he needed to put in 6.7 mils a day. If he had all those wet areas, he couldn't keep that irrigator going. He had to keep stopping it because he had all these problems with bogging. So by putting variable rate irrigation on that, he was able to dry out those areas. And if I have a show, we were getting this problem early on. By the time you started using variable rate irrigation, we were able to set that system up so that he didn't have that bogging problem, so that he could run that pivot. So the value of variable rate was really, really important. And we can show that if you can produce more grass, then the time for payback for that particular technology can be very quick. Now, I'll leave you with this. Rob said we're putting the water where it needs to go, we're using less power to do it, and we're growing more grass.
Thank you very much, James. Talking about irrigation. Bob, now I understand what you mean when Australians talk fast. Any question for James? Yes, at the back.
Out of those 3 years, how much fertiliser was applied?
I've certainly got that information off the top of my head. I'm not sure, but I think he was using somewhere around 300 kilos of N through that season. I'd have to check on the other.
And for that 6.2 megs and the 215 mil, what was the 215 mil time period for the 6.2 megs? Like, is it the same time period or?
Yes, so that was over the 6-month period of the season. So the rainfall that occurred right through that 6 months, yep, during the irrigation season.
Any other question for James? I've got one, James, probably. People get caught up on the technology itself, and you highlighted that it's not the technology, it's using the technology. What feedback have you had from Tassie farmers that are looking at the technology? Because I know there's a bit of going around sensors. What is your thoughts towards farmers around getting trapped in the sensor and not in managing the variability using the technology?
So when you talk about sensors, you talk about something like the soil moisture probes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. A lot of people don't tend to use soil moisture probes because the experience is that they'll get them, they'll put them in for a year, they'll fail, they'll stick them in the shed. My argument is that a soil moisture probe is useful to get you to calibrate your understanding of that site. You're going to spend $200,000 on putting some technology on there. You want to understand the site. So go out there and understand it. Use your technology to understand what's happening, to get you calibrated to what's happening. From then on, you can really use something like water budgeting, where you just understand how much is going in and how much is going out to be able to manage your scheduling. One of the key technologies is really having a good access to your evapotranspiration data. So using some apps that make it easy for you to grab that data will then help you to understand what's going out so that you can make sure you schedule to match what's going in. So yeah, certainly I encourage people to use technology like soil moisture probes initially, but then I want them to understand the system because that's what's going to lead to the difference.
Excellent. Thank you, James.